You're listening to the 3 Feet Radio Show with Ben Carbonaro and Luke Herbert. From our studios come special guests and netball commentary, exclusively on YouTube.
Welcome, listeners, to this latest installment of the 3 Feet Radio Show. I am co-host Luke Herbert, and I'm joined in the studio by the noted netball journalist Ben Carbonaro. How are you doing today, Ben?
Yeah, well, Luke, having a very enjoyable afternoon.
And Ben, please introduce our guest to the listener.
Joining us today, listeners, is the ANZ Championship's General Manager in Andy Crook. Hey, Andy, how are you?
I'm good, Ben. How are you, mate?
Yeah, very well, thank you.
Good.
Well, we'll get right into it because there's a fair bit we would like to get to cover with you. But last week, the netball community was divided on a range of proposed changes suggested for the ANZ Championship next year. And just before we get down to what those changes are, can you please tell us the reasoning behind them?
Yeah, look, I mean, the reality is that we're now in the 7th season of the ANZ Championship, and we on the TTNL board have a real appetite to continue to grow the competition. So we've been undertaking quite a long process to look at what opportunities we have to take it forward and grow the ANZ Championship in all markets. Yeah, look, that's the background, and the result is the proposal that's being put together at the moment.
I know one of the big things, Andy, that sort of was discussed, especially in Australia, was the possibility of the competition becoming a summer competition to allow for greater media coverage and that sort of thing in Australia. But just reading on the ANZ Championship website in preparing with our chat for you today, it said that you've decided, of course, you and the TTNL board have decided to have it remain as a winter competition for the foreseeable future.
Yeah, absolutely, Ben. It's something we look very closely at. And look, at the end of the day, in the best interest of the sport, we decided that wouldn't be a path we'd take. But as I said, the board were committed to look at all opportunities, and that was one of the range of opportunities that were available. But yeah, ultimately we decided that it will be remain a winter season.
Just before we leave the topic of where the competition sits in the calendar in terms of when it's played during the year, the big advantage I saw of moving the ANZ Championship to the summer time slot was that you moved it away from the Commonwealth Games and the World Championship in the 4-year cycle. So in the mind of the board, does the advantages of keeping its current time slot then outweigh the advantages of moving it away from those major competitions?
Yeah, look, I guess if you look at the next couple of years with the Commonwealth Games and the World Cup, that certainly would be the case. But if you project forward 4 or 5 years, you've got the Commonwealth Games in 2018, which is in April. So that in itself if we push the ANZ Championship season back into maybe a more traditional netball spot in winter, would get us around the fact that it would be played during the ANZ Championship season or interrupt the ANZ Championship season. So look, it's primarily one of the reasons why we considered it so strongly in terms of a move to summer was to take us away from what is a very cluttered market space with so many football codes being played during the winter period. And we want to try and get as much clear space as we possibly can. But ultimately, as I said, it's really important that we see the decision being that we stay in the winter period.
Yeah, Andy, could you tell us a little bit about the conference system? Is that similar to what's used in the ITM Cup and the domestic rugby union in New Zealand, is it? Or how does that all work?
Look, it's fairly simple, to be honest. And it's, essentially what we're doing is just breaking the teams down into almost an Australian table and a New Zealand table in terms of teams. So it's not majorly complicated. What would happen is, from the standings point of view and the points point of view, the top 3 teams from each of those ladders, if you like, would then head through into the final series. So, there's plenty of models like that around the world. This is just one model that we felt would particularly work for the ANZ Championship in its current format.
All right, and then assuming that this is the model that would go ahead, how would you respond to fan criticism that having 6 teams in the final, it's simply too many teams when there's only 10 teams in the whole competition?
Yeah, look, I mean, I've certainly read a lot of the fan comments over the last week or so, which is, we really appreciate a lot of the feedback that we get. One thing I'd say that, they're very passionate, which is great. But I guess firstly, this is not unusual in terms of world sport, where you may have more teams in the finals than not. I think the A-League's a classic example of that, where they have moved to six teams out of 10. And the reality is we're really keen to ensure that all markets are engaged in the ANZ Championship as long as possible, and that's really from a fan point of view as well. Fans certainly don't want to see their teams drop out of the race by rounds 7, 8, 9, 10. They want to see them competing right to the very end. So that's really important that all fans get the opportunity to see their team play finals, and ultimately if they're good enough to win, they'll go through and win the grand final. So we've compared it to other sports. We've certainly done all of our research and looked at the history of how the conference model would have played out if it had been in from the start, and we're confident that we will continue down the route of refining what that may look like.
Yeah, and Andy, there's also been the talk about the challenge system as well. How might it be determined which team is the first holder of the trophy?
Ben, that's a really interesting question. It's something we're going through at the moment and we're toing and froing on. I guess we're considering options of the winner of the grand final this year hosting or holding or being the inaugural holder of the trophy, whatever it's called, or going through a selection process, a random selection process to determine who would hold it. Now, we've obviously done a lot of research on this as well, and as it stands, which is a really interesting point for me, if it was selected randomly from the very start of the ANZ Championship in 2008, who would be the inaugural holder back then, regardless of who held it, it would now be held by the Central Pulse. So over 5 years, if we do select a random team, ultimately the team who deserves to hold it will end up holding it. So once we did the research, it was very interesting to see. But we'll continue to work on how that'll play out.
So could you just clarify for us that you were mentioning how the Pulse would have held it had it been at the start of the competition? Is that based on their win-loss record?
It's based on the record of who beats who during a home and away season. So if essentially by the round, so regardless who would have held it in 2008 from the very start of the competition, the ANZ Championship, I think it's by 2011 the Vixens would have held it regardless of which of the 10 teams would have been the inaugural holder. I think the Magic then beat the Vixens in Melbourne, and then the Magic would have held it for, I think it was 14 months. And then the Pulse beating the Magic this year in the Magic Heartland at home meant that the Pulse would now be the holder of the Challenge Trophy.
And many fans have suggested that maybe having a full 2-round competition would mean that each team, regardless of where they are on either side of the Tasman, would play each other home and away, regardless. Was there much looking into that by you or the TTNL board for the future as part of these suggestions?
Absolutely. Yep. No question about that. The reality is, we want to continue to grow the competition, and by adding, and there's no doubt, in the future, the TTNL board will look at introducing new teams to the league. By adding a home and away competition at the moment would probably almost preclude that. So we want to make sure that we've got the best opportunity to grow the sport and the ANZ Championship, as I talked about earlier. So in the best interest of, I guess, of that objective, the home and away model was decided against. And not only that, there's significant costs associated with a home and away series is pretty significant. So, and we're talking the millions of dollars. It's not just a couple $100,000. So it's, look, we considered it. It'll continue to be considered, but at the moment and for the foreseeable future, it won't be happening.
Just before we move on to the possibility of adding an additional team into the competition, a couple of queries that enter my mind about expanding to the full 2-round draw. Cost was one of them. You just covered it, but so I'll make this a 2-part question, if I may. When you refer to the cost increase, that would be then incurred by the teams themselves, wouldn't it?
There's probably 2 parts. One is the cost of, I guess, increase in player payments almost. The other one is the cost of travel. So the cost of travel is largely incurred by TTNL, but there is definitely an element for the teams. But then there's also the supporting of, we're talking an extra month of the season effectively if we went down one game every weekend. So the teams would have to pick up, obviously, all the operational costs involved in that as well.
Yeah, and the second part of my question, and you've just alluded to it right then, is the effect the extra month would have on the netball calendar. Wouldn't you then basically be pushing out, say, the Constellation Cup to about November, December?
Yeah, there's no doubt it has a knock-on effect, and obviously when we looked at all the different opportunities we had to consider the netball calendar and ultimately what is the shareholders of the ANZ Championship objectives in Netball Australia and Netball New Zealand. So obviously the international calendar was key, but so was grassroots netball, and so were the objectives of all of our teams. So in the best interest, including the calendar, that was another reason why we didn't go forward with it.
Andy, there's been calls maybe to add an extra team on this side of the Tasman in Australia, or maybe even get rid of one in New Zealand, or the other way around. Has there been discussions about adding a team or getting rid of a team somewhere down the track, or?
There certainly hasn't been discussion around getting rid of a team. There's been fairly early discussions around what it may look like if we introduced another team, regardless of where that's from. So, but they're very early stage discussions and nothing serious at the moment. More of a what if scenario rather than a hard and fast, this is what we want to do.
And while you're still at the very early stages, could you just outline what some of the factors would be in deciding where a sixth team went? Like, I think we can reasonably say it would go to Australia, if you don't mind me saying that now, just because New Zealand is fairly well covered by the existing 5 teams. But beyond that, there would be like the likes of commercial considerations, I would think.
Yeah, look, I mean, ultimately the team would have to be funded. So, it's obviously it costs in the millions to fund a team. So the costs have to be a very robust business case put forward to ensure that was a well operated and managed team. Athlete requirements is certainly something that will have to be considered. Where the athletes have come from, and as you've seen in the AFL, how you make sure that the actual team is competitive from the very start as well. So where the athletes came from to start the team would be a massive consideration, because we want to drop teams into our competitive to make sure that the competition remains competitive. So there's lots of that, and where the biggest markets are and the biggest opportunities are in terms of developing the ANZ Championship brand and the brand of the teams.
And just looking generally just at this season, Andy, you must be pretty happy with the significant increase in crowds. I mean, you only have to look at the good crowd they had the other night in WA at the Perth Arena, which is a fairly new venue, and also at Hisense Arena on the weekend for the Vixens game, and then the blockbuster game between the Swifts and the Thunderbirds. And it's great to get the crowd increase. And it's been increasing every season since 2008, hasn't it?
It has, yeah. Look, it's sensational. We're absolutely delighted. We really hope that continues. To break a record like we did on the weekend, is a huge credit, yes, to Netball Victoria and Netball New South Wales and the players to making sure they put on a good show. But, it's a great showing by the fans, and there's no better way of showing their support than by turning up and going through the turnstiles. So, it's certainly healthy. In terms of our fan base, and it's growing, so we're really pleased.
Well, we're talking of the fan base, and Ben and I were just chucking around some ideas off air about, how you could sort of expand the number of games played in the ANZ Championship, because we were, discussing the proposals, quite extensively. And one of the ideas we were chucking around is, could we see in the foreseeable future fans voting for 2 all-star teams and actually seeing a game between those 2 teams played?
I think you've been reading our whiteboard. Look, it's something we're certainly considering for the future. We'd love to see something like that, potentially for next year, but we've got to go through the process. It's obviously a World Cup year, so there's athlete welfare and athlete lows we want to consider. Look, an all-star concept got up a few years ago, but it was very much Australian dominated, and it wasn't quite what we'd probably ultimately like to see as an all-stars product. So we're building that at the moment, and we'd love to see something next year, but only time will tell whether we can get that in place.
That's obviously just one part of the fan engagement thing there, Andy. But at the same time too, we've seen the introduction of the Golden Boob this year, and I've been following it at work and not at work on social media. It looks like it's been pretty well received so far.
It has, yeah, really well received. I think one of the key points in ensuring its long-term sustainability as an award, I guess, is the players buy into it, and the players seem to have shown a lot of support, and it's great to see them getting rewarded on a weekly basis or recognised on a weekly basis. And the model was really designed on something like a Tour de France type yellow jersey model, and we'll continue to look at how we can expand that as well. We'd love to see the players who won it the previous week wearing the Golden Bib the week after, those sort of scenarios. So, I guess this year was, in our view, was the tester or the start of it, and we'll try and see it grow.
Just a sort of follow-up question to discussions about expanding the market for the ANZ Championship. And again, Ben and I have chucked this around a little bit off air. And do you look much at expanding the market from outside of Australia and New Zealand? For instance, netball is a growing sport in the UK now with their Super League, for instance.
Yeah, look, I mean that's an interesting question in itself as to how we go about doing that. They certainly have access to our live streaming in the UK and South Africa. I guess our view was that the biggest marketplace is probably the UK. However, our social media statistics are actually pointing that the South African markets are a really big market, and that could be because there are some key South African players who have come from over there and are now playing in the ANZ Championship, or it could just be because they've got a very large participation base. But expanding could be in the form of either games being played over there, broadcast, or who knows, in years to come, you might see a conference from either one of those countries if that's the way the ANZ Championship chooses to go in many years to come.
All right, Andy, thanks very much for the chat. Always appreciate you coming on to our show to explain the possible changes for the ANZ Championship, and onwards and upwards, looking ahead to the final series. Not long to go now.
Yeah, it's certainly coming closer, and it's very exciting. So looking forward to the big game on the weekend between the Firebirds and the Pulse, and it'll go a long way to determining who the final four will be.
You've been listening to the 3 Feet Radio Show with Ben Carbonaro and Luke Herbert. Tune in next time for more special guests and netball commentary exclusively on YouTube.